You are the only human species left alive. Read that sentence again, because it is one of the strangest facts about your entire existence, and almost nobody stops to notice it. Right now, on planet Earth, there is exactly one kind of human. One. Not two, not five, just you. Homo sapiens, alone at the top of a family tree that used to have branches. That has not always been true. For most of the last few million years, multiple human species walked the planet at the same time. At certain points, as many as 6 or 7 different kinds of humans existed simultaneously, on different continents, sometimes even overlapping in the exact same valleys. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Homo erectus across large parts of Asia, Homo floresiensis, a small-bodied species nicknamed the Hobbit, isolated on an Indonesian island. The Denisovans, known mostly from a handful of bone fragments and teeth in a Siberian cave. Homo naledi, discovered deep inside a South African cave system in a discovery so strange that scientists are still arguing about what it means. And us. All of them human. All of them gone, except one. So the real question is not really why our species survived. That part, at least on the surface, looks obvious. We are the ones telling the story, so of course the story ends with us. The genuinely unsettling question is the opposite one. What happened to the others? Because extinction, on this scale, across an entire genus, is not normal. It should not have happened this cleanly, and for a long time, scientists did not agree on why it did. Let's start with the species most people have actually heard of, Neanderthals. For roughly 400,000 years, Neanderthals thrived across Europe and parts of Western Asia. They were not the stooped, dim-witted cartoon villains you might remember from old textbooks. Neanderthal brains were, on average, slightly larger than modern human brains. They controlled fire, they made sophisticated stone tools, they buried their dead, sometimes with what looks like deliberate care. Recent excavations have even found evidence suggesting some Neanderthal groups created cave markings, wore eagle talons as jewelry, and used pigments in ways that at least resemble symbolic behavior. By roughly 40,000 years ago, they were gone. Not gradually faded, gone. In evolutionary terms, that is an almost shockingly fast collapse for a species that had already survived hundreds of thousands of years, multiple ice ages, and enormous climate swings. Here is where it gets genuinely strange. Neanderthals did not go extinct in the way a species usually does, quietly, off in isolation, unnoticed. They went extinct while living directly alongside us. Genetic evidence confirms that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals encountered each other repeatedly and did a lot more than just encounter each other. Most people alive today who are not of sub-Saharan African descent carry somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. That number sounds small until you realize what it actually means. It means interbreeding happened often enough, across a wide enough population, over a long enough period, that the genetic signature never got diluted out of existence. Neanderthals did not simply disappear from the planet. In a very real sense, they were partially absorbed into us. But partial absorption does not explain full extinction. If Neanderthals were being folded into the Homo sapiens population through interbreeding, something else was also happening at the same time, something that prevented Neanderthal populations from continuing as a distinct, self-sustaining group. And this is where the leading theories start to diverge, because there almost certainly was not one single cause. There were several, compounding on top of each other. The first factor is population size, and it is more brutal than it sounds. Genetic analysis of Neanderthal remains suggests their populations were small and increasingly fragmented, likely numbering in the tens of thousands at most, spread thinly across an enormous geographic range. Small populations are fragile in a way large populations are not. Bad luck that a large population can absorb, a rough winter, a disease outbreak, a failed hunting season, can wipe out a huge percentage of a small, scattered group. Homo sapiens populations, by contrast, appear to have been larger and more interconnected, with evidence of long-distance trade networks moving materials like seashells and obsidian hundreds of kilometers from their source. That kind of network matters enormously in a crisis. If your local group is struggling, a connected network means somewhere else might not be, and help, mates, or resources can move along that network. An isolated group has no such safety net. The second factor is direct competition for resources, and it is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. Multiple hominin species sharing overlapping territory were almost certainly hunting many of the same animals and gathering many of the same plants. If Homo sapiens groups were even slightly more efficient at extracting calories from the same landscape through better tools, more flexible hunting strategies, or more complex social coordination, that advantage would not need to be dramatic to matter. Over hundreds of generations, a small, consistent edge compounds into a decisive one. Nobody needed to win a single dramatic confrontation. They just needed to slightly outcompete the other species for food, generation after generation, until the math stopped working in the other direction. The third factor is climate, and it is the one that gets underestimated the most. The period during which Neanderthals declined overlapped with a series of severe climate fluctuations, rapid temperature swings, beings that reshaped vegetation and prey animal distribution across huge portions of Europe and Asia. Species that are already population stressed are far less able to absorb environmental shocks. A species with larger, more flexible, more widely distributed populations has more room to adapt, relocate, or simply outlast a bad few centuries. A species already thin on the ground does not have that margin. And then there is disease, which is almost never discussed but may have been devastating. When two closely related hominin populations that had been isolated from each other for hundreds of thousands of years came back into contact, they would have been exposed to pathogens their immune systems had no prior experience with. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. We have direct historical proof of exactly this mechanism at work far more recently, during European contact with the Americas, where introduced diseases devastated indigenous populations far more effectively than any weapon. There is no reason the same biological principle would not have applied tens of thousands of years earlier, in a much less documented, much less traceable way. Put all of that together, small fragmented populations, direct resource competition, climate volatility, and possible disease exposure, and you get a slow, grinding decline rather than a single dramatic ending. Not a war, not a massacre, though localized violent conflict may well have happened in places. Mostly, just an accumulation of small disadvantages that a marginal population could not absorb indefinitely. Neanderthals were not even close to alone in this pattern. Homo floresiensis, the small-bodied hobbit species discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores, seems to have persisted in isolation until surprisingly recently, potentially as late as 50,000 years ago, overlapping with modern humans arriving in the region. Homo erectus, one of the longest surviving human species in the entire fossil record, spanning close to 2 million years, held on in parts of Southeast Asia until perhaps 100,000 years ago, according to some contested but compelling dating evidence. The Denisovans remain the most mysterious of all. We know almost nothing about their appearance, since we have only a handful of bone fragments, a finger bone, a few teeth, part of a jawbone. What we do know comes almost entirely from DNA, and that DNA tells us they interbred with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, leaving genetic traces that persist today in some Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations at levels reaching several percent. Every single one of these species vanished within a strikingly similar window, roughly between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, right around the time Homo sapiens was expanding rapidly out of Africa and into new territory across the entire planet. That timing is not a coincidence anyone takes lightly. Wherever Homo sapiens arrived in meaningful numbers, the local human species that had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years did not last much longer. This raises an uncomfortable question that is worth sitting with honestly. Was Homo sapiens simply better adapted, or was our species, in some sense, actively responsible? The honest scientific answer is that both framings are probably too clean. We do not need to imagine coordinated extermination campaigns to explain what happened. Slow demographic replacement, sustained resource competition, and genetic absorption through interbreeding can fully account for the disappearance of a population without requiring constant violence, even if violence occurred in places, as it likely did wherever human groups have ever competed for scarce resources. What makes our species different was probably not raw intelligence in some simple sense. Neanderthal brains were comparable in size and clearly capable of complex behavior. The more likely difference lies in social scale and flexibility. Evidence increasingly suggests Homo sapiens formed larger social networks, exchanged resources and information across greater distances, and adapted behaviorally to new environments faster than other hominin species did. Culture, in other words, may have been our actual weapon, not in the sense of art and ritual alone, but in the sense of accumulated, transmitted, constantly improving knowledge that lets small advantages compound relentlessly over thousands of years. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This was not ancient history happening to some other species, distant and unrelated. This was the closest possible relative, in some cases genetically close enough to produce fertile offspring, going extinct while living in direct contact with the direct ancestors of literally everyone alive today. If you carry Neanderthal DNA, and there is a very good chance you do, you are not just descended from the survivors of that extinction event. You are, in a very literal biological sense, carrying pieces of the extinct species inside you right now. Homo sapiens is not the human species that was destined to succeed from the very beginning. We are the one branch, out of at least 6 or 7, that happen to combine large interconnected populations, flexible culture, and enough resilience to survive climate chaos that our closest relatives could not. Every other branch of the human family tree ran out of road. Ours, for reasons that are only partially understood even now, did not. You are not the inevitable endpoint of human evolution. You are the surviving exception,